cosmos is 15 billion years old, and the world is 4.5 billion years old, and there's been life for 3.5 billion years, and there were creatures that had pretty developed nervous systems 300 to 600 million years ago, and we were living in trees as small mammals 60 million years ago, and we were down on the plains between 60 million and 7 million years ago, and that's about when we split from chimpanzees, and modern human beings seem to emerge about 150,000 years ago, and civilization pretty much after the last ice age, something after 15,000 years ago. Not very long ago at all, you know. And that's the span across which I want to understand. That's the span across which I want to understand. I want to understand why we are the way we are, looking at life in its continual complexity, right from the beginning of life itself. And there's some real utility in that because we share attributes with other animals, even animals as simple as crustaceans, for example, have nervous system properties that are very much like ours, and it's very much worth knowing that. And so I think in an evolutionary way, I think it's a grand and remarkable way to think because it has this incredible time span, right? It's this amazing, I mean, people at the end of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, thought the world was about 6,000 years old. I mean, 15 billion years old, that's a lot more, right? It's a lot grander, it's a lot bigger, but it's also a lot more frightening and alienating in some sense because, you know, the cosmos has become so vast, it's either easy for human beings to think of themselves as trivial specks on a trivial speck out some misbegotten hellhole end of the galaxy among hundreds of millions of galaxies, right? It's very easy to see yourself as nothing in that span of time. And that's a real challenge for people, and I think it's a mistake to think that way. Because I think consciousness is far more than we think it is, but it's still something we have to grapple with. I'm a psychoanalytic thinker, and what that means is that I believe that people are collections of subpersonalities and that those subpersonalities are alive. They're not machines. They have their viewpoint, they have their wants, they have their perceptions, they have their arguments, they have their emotions. They're like low-resolution representations of you. You know, when you get angry, it's a very low-resolution representation of you. It only wants rage, or it only wants something to eat, or it only wants water, it only wants sex. It's you, but shrunk and focused in a specific direction. And all those motivational systems are very, very ancient, very archaic, and very, very powerful. And they play a determining role in the manner in which we manifest ourselves. And as Freud pointed out with the id, we have to figure out how to take all those underlying animalistic motivations and emotions and civilize them in some way so that we can all live in the same general territory without tearing each other to shreds, which is maybe the default position of both chimpanzee and humanity. So I take that seriously, the idea that we're a loose collection of spirits, and that it says in the Old Testament somewhere that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I think this is akin to that. If you know that you're not in control of yourself thoroughly, and that there are other factors behind the scenes, like the Greeks thought that human beings were the playthings of the gods. That's the way they conceptualized the world. They sort of meant the same thing. They meant that there are these great forces that move us, that we don't create, that we're subordinate to in some sense. Not entirely, but we can be subordinate to them, and they move our destinies. That was the Greek view, and there was something, it teaches you humility to understand that there's a hell of a lot more going on behind the scenes, and you're the driver of a very complex vehicle, but you don't understand the vehicle very well. And it's got its own motivations and methods, and sometimes you think it's doing something and it's doing something completely different. You see that in psychotherapy all the time because, you know, you help someone unwind a pattern of behavior that they've manifested forever. First of all, they describe it, then they become aware of it, then maybe they start to see what the cause is. They had no idea why they were acting like that. You know, they have to have the memory that produced the behavioral pattern to begin with. It has to be brought back to mind, and then it has to be analyzed and assessed, and then they have to think about a different way of acting, and it's extraordinarily complex. So, psychoanalytic, literary. Well, there's this postmodern idea about literature, and about the world for that matter, that if you take a complex piece of literature like a Shakespeare play, there's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it. You know, you can interpret each word, you can interpret each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph, you can interpret the entire play. The way you interpret it depends on how many other books you've read, depends on your orientation in the world. It depends on a very, very large number of things, how cultured you are or how much culture you lack. All of those things. It opens up a huge vista for potential interpretation. And so the postmoderns sort of stubbed their toe on that and thought, well, if there's this vast number of interpretations of any particular literary work, how can you be sure that any interpretation is more valid than any other interpretation? And if you can't be sure, then how do you even know those are great works? How do you know they can't? Maybe they're just works that the people in power have used to facilitate their continual accession of power, which is really a postmodern idea, and a very, very cynical one, but it has its point. But the thing is, it's grounded in something real, right? It's like, yes, you can interpret things forever. Nietzsche, when he proclaimed the death of God, which by the way was no triumphant proclamation, because he also mentioned that we would never find enough water to wash away the blood, which was his, what would you call it, prognostication for the 20th century, and a very accurate one at that. He believed that we would, in some sense, have to become as gods in ourselves in order to replace what we had lost. He thought that the collapse of the Judeo-Christian structure would be absolutely catastrophic for the West. And I believe that he was correct. And that the way out of that would be that we'd have to create our own values. We'd have to take the place of what was once, let's say, externalized and divine onto ourselves. And, you know, it's a hell of a theory. And it's not, and Nietzsche is not an easy person to criticize, because you have to do a lot of reading before you find someone who's 1/10 as smart as Nietzsche. He has this funny line about his books. It's really quite comical. He said, it takes most writers a whole book to write what I can write in a sentence. Then he said, no, they can't even manage it in a book. And that's actually true. I mean, if you read Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, for example, you see that his thought is so powerful that it's really a kind of miracle. What the psychoanalysts realized, though, this was particularly Jung's contribution, I would say, Carl Jung's contribution. He was a great student of Nietzsche, a real admirer of Nietzsche, and really someone who was trying to solve the problem that Nietzsche had put forward, which was, well, our underlying metaphysics, our religious structure had collapsed, and that was the story upon which our entire culture was based, for better or worse. It had collapsed. And we needed to do something about that, and we were doing various things. We were turning to fascism, let's say, or we were turning to communism, both ideological replacements for more fundamental religious beliefs. But that Nietzsche's suggestion that we turn to ourselves to extract out our own values, to create our own values, let me be more accurate about that, happened to be untrue, because we weren't the sort of creatures who were actually capable of doing that. And it's one of the reasons I love Jung and his biological take, in some sense, towards human beings, because Jung firmly believed, and I think all of the evidence supports him, believed that human beings actually had a nature, you know, that we weren't merely social constructions, which we certainly aren't, despite what the social constructionists insist upon forcing us to think increasingly through legislative means, and that we had to wrestle with what it was that we were. You know, even though we're our own creatures in some sense, we also have to wrestle with our intrinsic nature. And we know about the nature part of that more and more. I mean, we know more about our neurocircuitry, for example. We know that there's a circuit for rage, and there's a circuit for fear, and there's a biological system for jealousy, and there's a system for altruism, and there's a circuit for play, and there's another one for pleasure, and there's a complex circuit for negative emotion, pain and anxiety and frustration and disappointment, guilt and shame. And we know that human beings share that motivational structure, not only with all other human beings, but certainly with all mammals and almost all animals. And so that the biological component of us is unbelievably deep, right? It's tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and even billions of years old. I read an interesting paper just the other day. You know, I tend to talk about lobsters more than the average person. And one of the points I made in 12 Rules for Life was that our neurochemistry, at least some of it, is so similar. It's been conserved so completely throughout the immense duration of evolution, hundreds of millions of years, that lobsters, like human beings, appear to become the lobster equivalent of depressed if they suffer a hierarchy defeat, and that if you give them chemicals that are roughly analogous to human antidepressants, it perks them right back up. Their posture improves and they'll go off and fight. And you know, when I first discovered that, it just blew me away. I never recovered from it. I thought, my God, really, that the continent is 350 million years of continuity in the structure of those systems. And you know, we know the serotonin system, which is the system I'm talking about, does govern your observation of where you sit in a social hierarchy, like it does for many, many animal species. And as one consequence of that, regulates your emotions, so that if it sees that you're a relatively high status creature in your local environment, then it tends to allow you to feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion. And if it sees you as a low status creature in your local comparative environment, then it does the opposite. It overwhelms you with negative emotion and suppresses positive emotion. And so, you know, and that's really bad. No one likes that. It's fundamentally, there's really nothing worse that can happen to you than that, to have those emotions adjusted in that manner, so that the incentive reward and the motivation and the positive emotion vanishes from your life. So there's nothing to be enthusiastic or excited about, and all of the negative emotions, pain, disappointment, frustration, grief, all of those terrible negative emotions are tremendously magnified. No one wants that. It's the last thing you want. Perhaps it's the last thing you want. And you know, that's partly why people are very, let's call it, what would you say? They're willing to fight for their position in their status hierarchy, and even for the existence of the hierarchies themselves. So anyways, it is the case that human beings have a nature, and we have to contend with that nature, and so we can't just create our own values. And what Jung, especially Jung, Freud started it, but especially Jung, believed that, well, in some sense, what had happened was that we had lost the externalized religious narrative that had been projected by our imagination out onto the world. You know, you think about the constellations and the names of the constellations, and the idea that the skies were populated by gods. You know, that was an externalization of our imagination, right? Projected out into the world. We were seeing the world through our imagination, and which is exactly how we do see the world. And as we proceed, we're better able to distinguish, let's say, what's imagination from what's objective world. But that doesn't mean the imagination disappears or that it's without value, because the imagination is part of what helps us, let's say, confront the future, because we do that with our imagination, and to compose things in possibility before we realize them in actuality. So for Jung, the world of gods just collapsed within, back into the imagination, and it was into the imagination that we had to go again to discover what we had lost, to discover these lost values. And that's akin, in some sense, I suppose, to rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. A very brilliant intellectual tour de force to manage that supposition, especially back when he did it. And I think I see no evidence whatsoever that he was wrong, given, as I said, our radical inability to command ourselves as if we are our own in some fundamental way. We seem subject to intractable moral laws. And I'm not trying to make a case for the accuracy of those laws necessarily, or for their metaphysical origin, but I am trying to make a case for their psychological and phenomenological reality. You definitely experience them insofar as you suffer, let's say, from the pricks and arrows of your own conscience. And I doubt if there's a single person in this room who doesn't regularly suffer in that manner, and some of you suffer like that virtually all the time, which can also be a problem. In any case, it's interesting to note that we're not exactly masters in our own houses. And that's such an interesting thing to note, because you think, well, if we're not masters in our own houses, well, what is it? Is it just a chaotic internal structure? Is it merely the voice of nature and nature's various instinctual subsystems? That doesn't seem to be correct, because we do integrate them into something approximating a unity. There's more than just the basics of nature. We have language, we have communication, we have culture. We build up above nature something that's more than nature, but we're still beholden to it. The question is, well, what are we beholden to? What is this that we're beholden to? And socially, politically, and individually, that we cannot escape from? Well, so that's part of the question. Do you believe in God? Well, that's part of the answer, actually. And, it's no bleak answer. But the first thing I'm trying to say is, try controlling yourself. Try acting as if you're the fundamental source of your own values, independent of any, what would you call it, transcendent ethical structure. Just see if you can do that. But try it for a week, try it for a month. I've never met anybody that could do it, not even for a moment. I mean, I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but I would highly recommend that if you're interested in this sort of thing, because it's the definitive study of this idea. Because in Crime and Punishment, the protagonist commits the perfect murder, and he has his reasons for it, and many reasons, because Dostoevsky didn't mess around. When he wanted to give someone reasons, he gave them reasons, and Raskolnikov, the main character, had reasons for murder. And then he commits his murder, and he gets away with it. But things don't go well for Raskolnikov, because one of the things he finds out is that the Raskolnikov that you were before you committed the murder is not the same as the Raskolnikov as you are after you've committed the murder. And there's a dividing line there that you don't, it's like the red pill, I guess, right? It's that's the Matrix, correct? The red pill. And once there's certain actions, once you take them, there's no going back. And so that's what Crime and Punishment is about. And Raskolnikov tortures himself to death, well, not literally, but metaphysically, psychologically, because he cannot tolerate breaking the great moral code. And so it's a great book. It's truly a great book, and it's also extraordinarily, like it's a murder mystery thriller as well as being a deep philosophical book. So if you're in the mood for a murder mystery thriller that's also a deep philosophical book, then that's the one for you. So now, one of the other speakers on the panel, Van Badham, who was described not by me as a writer, activist, and Twitter queen, which is, I think, like being the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, something like that. I went on her Twitter site today to find out how many followers she has, but apparently I'm not one of them because I'm blocked. And it kind of surprises me, because I didn't know that I'd ever tried to follow her. But anyways, she said, and this was interesting, she said, I'm a Christian and a Marxist. And I thought, no. You can only be a Christian and a Marxist if you, well, there's a couple of ways. One is that you just want to be all things that are good at once, regardless of their internal contradictions. And so that would be one reason. And another reason would be that you don't know anything about Christianity or Marxism. And then the next would be that you're just compartmentalized.
You know, like there's this idea that people can't hold two contradictory thoughts in their mind at the same time. Well, that idea was formulated by someone who's never met a human being, because you can hold like 50 contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time, as you know, whenever you argue with someone that you love, because you love them and maybe you even like them, but you also hate them and you wish that you could just crush them right there and then. And so, like, that's a lot of contradictory ideas, and that's probably only like half the contradictory ideas that are running through your mind at the moment. You know, so man, you're so full of contradictions that it's just beyond belief. And the only time, I mean, I know this because I read undergraduate essays. And what's interesting about undergraduate essays is it's so interesting because the undergraduate will make a claim in paragraph 1, and then in paragraph 7 will make the opposite claim, and they won't notice that they're intellectually incommensurate. And you know, that might happen 30 times in the essay. And the reason that works is because, well, they haven't been called on paradoxes, but also because they haven't had to live the paradoxes through, because you really only straighten out your thought when you have like impulse A and impulse B, and they conflict at the same time, right? And you can either do one or the other, but not both. You know, if it's A today and B tomorrow, well, then you can hold those ideas simultaneously. But if it's A or B right now, then you have to decide, is A more important or is B more important? You have to put them in a hierarchy, and then you have to act them out, and you have to see what happens. And so then you find out if you're full of contradictions, and part of the way that you iron out your contradictions, which is very, very hard to do, is that you go out and you do a whole bunch of things in the world, like Socrates did. You have your adventure in the world, and you put your ideas to the test, and those that work out in a paradoxical or counterproductive manner you dispense with or put lower on the priority list or something like that. And that's how you discover that, you know, you can't hold incommensurate views simultaneously. Carl Jung said that something like paradoxical views that are not made conscious will be played out in the world as fate. And that's really worth thinking about too. So if you have your, let's call it your typical negative experience, you know, this thing that just seems to just keep happening to you, bad luck, let's call it, it's highly probable that there's a set of ideas that are occupying you, preoccupying you, possessing you, that are driving you in this direction continually, and that you can't or won't work out the contradiction, and as a consequence, you know, maybe you think every woman is your mother, and you haven't noticed that you think that, and that you know, and it is something that people think, because mothers are women, and it's not a bad initial template, but you know, you gotta modify it to some degree. And you know, if that's an unconscious idea that you have and you continue to play it out, you may run into your continual, habitual negative experience with women, and you'll wonder what the hell is wrong with women, but it isn't the women that has the problem, it's you. And you know, if you run into problems with women all the time, then it's highly probable that the problem is you. So, not always, but generally. So, well, let's go into this Marxist and Christian idea here just for a minute. So, we'll start with some of the ideas of Marx. Well, Marx believed that people were basically socially constructed, so that we were blank slates, and that whatever our nature was given to us essentially by our surroundings, but even more importantly by our social class, right? Because Marx was a theorist of social class and believed that the primary dispute, let's say, the primary motivator of human history, the primary driver of human history was something like the rich versus the poor, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And that was a consequence of your social upbringing, and that your group identity was paramount. Okay, so there's nothing about that that's vaguely Christian. That's not how the Christian worldview works. It's not how the Judeo-Christian worldview works, because in that worldview, you're fundamentally an individual. Your nature is fundamentally attributable to you by God. You're fundamentally responsible to God, and your and history itself is something like the playing out of your relationship to the transcendent. So those things aren't the same. They're not commensurate. You can't believe both of them at the same time. Marxism is a materialistic philosophy. It's predicated on the idea that essentially, an idea that Dostoevsky criticized in great depth was that if you just made people rich enough, let's say, if you deprived them of their privation, if you equalized their economic status, let's say, that the utopia would come to light upon earth. And, you know, I have a certain amount of sympathy for a viewpoint like that because, you know, who likes starvation and misery? You know, there's nothing positive to be said about that, but I think Dostoevsky was right too in his criticism of Marxism, although he wasn't directly aiming this at Marx, in Notes from Underground, where he noted that, you know, if you gave people what they wanted in terms of, let's say, bread and circuses, if they had, as he said, nothing to do but eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, which is kind of a nice phrase, that the first thing they would do is take a hammer and smash things just so that something improbable and strange would happen, just so that we could have our way. You know, and it's kind of a recapitulation of the idea of original sin in Dostoevsky's subtle manner, is that we're the sorts of creatures that, you know, what did he say? We're ungrateful. That's the thing that primarily distinguishes us from animals, is we're ungrateful and that we can curse. That was what he thought made us different than animals. And that even if we got what we wanted materially, that wouldn't satisfy us because we're not the sorts of creatures that can be satisfied with material possessions, let's say, or material comfort, because it isn't even obvious that we're after comfort. I mean, what do you want? You want to just lay in a feather bed and eat peeled grapes all day? I mean, maybe for an hour or so, that might not be a bad idea, but, you know, it's going to get dull pretty quick. You're going to go out looking for trouble. And it's certainly possible that the more material resources and the easier they were to get that you have at your disposal, the more creative ways you're going to find to cause yourself trouble when you go out and look for trouble. And that's a testament to the human spirit, and Dostoevsky knew this. It's like, well, whatever we're here for, it isn't the utopia of equal material distribution. We're not looking to be fed and asleep, you know? And I don't know what it is that we're looking for. God only knows. Maybe what we're looking for is to continually keep looking, something like that. I mean, that's the sorts of creatures that we are.